A drunk loser peed on a royal guard's shoes, thinking the guard wouldn't move. But one well-aimed kick left him lying in his own wee. Here's what happened. Before we go on, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel if you respect the royal guards. The sound of smashing glass broke the quiet evening. Whoops! A rough laugh came from across the courtyard, followed by the obvious sound of someone tripping over. Bloody hell! Who put that there? Colin Baker appeared from the shadows. His t-shirt was dirty with beer and sweat, smelling of an afternoon in the local pub. He walked wonkily across the palace grounds, leaving a trail of moved gravel and mumbled swear words. The strong smell of cheap beer and fags came before his voice did. Bet you're bloody roasting in that silly outfit, Colin said, getting closer with wobbly steps. His football shirt was loose and creased, dirty from what had clearly been a loud afternoon watching the game at the pub. All these fancy clothes, standing around like a toy soldier. Peter didn't move, his eyes looking straight ahead with the focus of someone who'd faced much worse than drunk football fans. His time in Iraq had taught him to be patient under pressure, though he doubted his boss had expected this kind of threat during training. Colin walked around the guard, his old trainers scraping against the gravel. Not very talkative, are you? He leaned in close enough for Peter to smell the sour mix of cheap beer and fags on his breath. Come on, mate. Give us a smile, a wave, something for all this. He waved vaguely at the palace walls. Standing around, you do. The evening air got thicker with tension as Colin continued his wobbly circle. Security cameras followed his movements, their silent lenses recording what was quickly becoming more than just another tourist's bad behavior. Several people walking by had stopped to watch, their faces showing a mix of worry and grim curiosity. You know what your problem is? Colin poked a finger towards Peter's chest, stopping just before touching. You think you're better than us, don't you, with your fancy hat and your shiny buttons? His voice had the rude confidence that only comes after too many drinks, each word a challenge to anyone nearby. Peter stood still, though his senses, sharpened by years in the army, noticed every detail of the worsening situation, the way Colin's right hand kept clenching and unclenching, the growing confidence in his stance, the dangerous tone creeping into his voice, all were warning signs of someone about to make a big mistake. Colin stumbled closer, almost falling over as he steadied himself against a nearby fence. His football shirt, showing the marks of a day spent at the pub watching Manchester United lose badly, hung loosely from his shoulders. My mates at the pub, they said you lot can't move. Like proper statues, yeah? He reached out and flicked one of the gold buttons on Peter's jacket, his wobbly finger making a dull ping against the metal. But I reckon everyone's got a breaking point, even you fancy blokes in red. The remaining tourists had formed a loose semi-circle, staying what they hoped was a safe distance away. An older man with a veteran's badge on his jacket watched with growing worry, his old face getting darker at each new insult. His own medals, earned in wars most had forgotten, caught the fading sunlight as he shifted his weight, ready to step in if needed. Hey, soldier boy! Colin's voice became mocking, words slurring together like spilled beer. Did they forget to wind you up this morning? He waved his hand in front of Peter's face, close enough that the guard could smell the mix of beer, pickled onions, and salt and vinegar crisps from the pub. The sour breath of too many pints washed over Peter's face as Colin leaned in closer. Maybe you need a drink to loosen up. Always works for me. Never met a problem that another round couldn't fix. A group of American tourists whispered to each other, their cameras lowered out of respect or embarrassment. A young boy pulled at his mum's sleeve, asking in a loud whisper why the man was being so nasty to the soldier. His mum quickly led him away, her face tight with disapproval. Without warning, Colin pushed his half-empty beer can towards Peter's face, liquid, spilling over the edge. Several drops splashed against the guard's spotless uniform, leaving dark marks on the red fabric that spread like bloody stars. A gasp came from the watchers, but Peter stayed perfectly still, his control unwavering. Years of training held firm, though under his calm look, every muscle had tensed, ready for action. "Oops," Colin chuckled, his coordination getting worse as he tried a silly bow that nearly made him fall over. "Suppose you'll need to get that dry cleaned. Do they even let you take these fancy clothes off? Or do you sleep standing up like a horse?" He straightened up, swaying like a tree in a strong wind. "Bet you've got to ask the Queen's permission just to take a piss, don't you?" Some tourists began to move away, parents covering their children's ears, but others stayed, glued to the unfolding scene. A couple of teenagers had their phones half raised, stuck between wanting to record the event and worrying about what might happen next. He started walking around Peter again, his movements becoming more unsteady, like a moth drawn to a dangerous flame. "Look at this rifle thing." He slurred, reaching out to touch the special weapon. His fingers came within inches of the shiny wood. "Probably not even real, is it? Just like everything else about this place. All for show. Bet it's made of plastic, like them toys they sell in the gift shop." Peter's grip on his rifle tightened very slightly, the only outward sign of his growing awareness of the threat. The leather of his gloves creaked softly with the pressure, a sound lost under Colin's constant taunts. His army training had taught him to read situations, to expect danger before it fully appeared. Right now, every instinct sharpened by years of active service was telling him this was about to get worse, beyond simple drunken taunts. "My tax money pays for this, you know," Colin went on, getting bolder with each unanswered taunt. His voice had the rude confidence of someone who'd never actually faced real consequences for his actions. "Pays for you to stand here like a bloody mannequin. Least you could do is give us a proper show for our money. Dance for us, soldier boy." The veteran in the crowd took a half step forward, his own army stance clear in his movement. His wife put a stopping hand on his arm, her grip tightening as Colin's behavior got worse. They'd seen this kind of thing before during their years living near army bases. It would either sort itself out or... The thought stayed unfinished as Colin's actions reached new levels of rudeness. Colin's attention suddenly fixed on Peter's bearskin hat, his blurry eyes narrowing as if seeing it for the first time. "That's real fur, innit?" He reached up, fingers grabbing at the air inches from the special hat. His breath was visible in the cooling evening air. "Bet it's hot under there. Maybe I should help you take it off. Do you a favor, like. Must be cooking your brain, standing out here all day like a proper mug." The security cameras continued their silent watch as Colin's actions became more and more aggressive, their lenses recording every moment of what was quickly becoming more than just another drunk tourist event. He started copying the guard's stance, overdoing the stillness with drunken drama that made several watchers wince. "Look at me. I'm a fancy palace guard. Too important to talk to normal folk. Too posh to even blink." His mocking became physical as he began marching in circles around Peter, his movements a rough copy of the guard's special precision. Each step was overdone, his feet dragging and scraping against the old stones. Left, right," he chanted, tripping over his own feet and nearly falling several times. All dressed up with nowhere to go, just like them toy soldiers in the shop windows. Wind them up and watch them march. The evening had got darker, casting long shadows across the palace grounds. The setting sun painted the scene in shades of amber and red, matching the guard's uniform and highlighting the growing danger in the situation. Colin's behavior was drawing more attention now, his voice carrying clearly in the cooling air. Other guards in the distance had noticed, their own poses staying perfect while their attention shifted subtly towards the problem. "Come on, mate," he pleaded, his tone switching between mocking and fake friendliness, like a radio stuck between stations. "You can't stand there forever. Everyone's got to take a piss sometimes, right? Even the Queen's got to go sometime." He laughed loudly at his own joke, the sound bouncing off the palace walls. He swayed dangerously close to Peter again, nearly bumping into the guard's perfectly positioned shoulder. "Speaking of which—" His hands moved to his belt, the action carrying a clear threat of what was to come. The metal buckle clinked worryingly in the evening quiet. "Maybe that's what you need. A little push to move, something to warm up them fancy boots of yours." Peter stayed still, but his army-trained senses were on high alert. Every muscle in his body was ready, coiled like a spring under his special uniform. He'd dealt with aggressive drunks before, both in and out of uniform, but something in Colin's worsening behavior suggested this situation was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Years of fighting experience told him exactly where this was heading. "Still nothing?" Colin's voice got nasty, all pretend humor gone like the last rays of sunlight. "Right then. Let's see how long you can keep up this statue act when I give you something real to think about." His fingers fumbled with his zip, the sound seeming to echo in the suddenly silent courtyard. His intentions became horribly clear to the watching crowd, several of whom began backing away more quickly now. "Time to water the Queen's garden in it?" His drunken determination overcoming any last bit of common sense or basic decency. "Since you're so good at standing still," he slurred, "let's see how you handle this, soldier boy." A woman in the crowd turned away, disgusted, quickly pulling her children towards the gates. The veteran who had been watching clenched his fists, years of army discipline barely containing his urge to step in. His wife's grip on his arm tightened. They both knew this had gone far beyond a simple drunk's silliness. "Always wanted to leave my mark on history," Colin said with drunken loudness, positioning himself on purpose in front of Peter. "Guess this is one way to do it." He began to sway dangerously, barely keeping his balance as he aimed at the guard's perfectly polished boots. Peter stayed still, but there was a new tension in his stance, small changes that only another soldier would notice. His eyes, still fixed forward, had taken on the sharp focus of a war veteran assessing a threat. His grip on the special rifle shifted almost unseen, muscle memory from years of service preparing for what might come next. The first splash of liquid against leather broke the evening's tense silence. Colin had begun to whistle tunelessly as he peed, on purpose directing the stream onto Peter's boots. The polished black leather, which had shone with hours of careful care, began to get dark with the insult. "Look at that!" Colin shouted, his voice carrying across the now silent courtyard. "Not so perfect now, are you?" He continued his act, swaying slightly as he ruined the uniform that generations of soldiers had worn with pride. "Might want to rethink that whole standing still business, mate." The remaining watchers stood frozen, shocked but unable to look away from the scene unfolding before them. Several had pulled out phones, though whether to call security or record the coming results of Colin's actions wasn't clear. The evening air had got thick with tension, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. "Almost done," Colin said, seemingly proud of his drunken defiance. "Unless you want to move now." He laughed at his own joke, completely missing the small changes in Peter's posture. The guard's stance had shifted almost unseen, his weight moving in a way that would have worried anyone with army training. The veteran in the crowd knew the signs. He took a step back, pulling his wife with him. Years of service had taught him to read the warning signs of coming action, and every instinct told him this situation was about to explode. "Still playing statue?" Colin mocked, focused on his rude act. "Well, you can't say I didn't give you a chance to move." He was so busy with his awful behavior that he failed to notice the tiny changes in Peter's stance, the slight bend in the knee, the small shift of weight to the back foot. Time seemed to slow as Colin continued his drunken rant, still peeing on the guard's boots. "Guess this is why they call you the Queen's Guard. Too posh to even take a proper piss." His laughter bounced off the palace walls, about to be cut short. Peter had put up with insults, mocking, and hassle, with the patience his job demanded. But this final disrespect of his uniform, the uniform that represented centuries of service and sacrifice, had crossed a line. His army training had taught him about the right response, about measured action when faced with threats. In the split second before he moved, that training worked out direction, force, and result with deadly accuracy. What happened next occurred with such army accuracy that many watchers would later argue about whether they had actually seen it. Peter's leg snapped up in a perfect curve, his polished boot hitting its target with surgical skill. Years of combat training combined with ceremonial discipline in one devastating movement. The impact was immediate and clear. Colin's stream stopped mid-flow as Peter's boot connected squarely with his groin, the force lifting him several inches off the ground. His eyes bulged, mouth forming a perfect O of surprise and agony. The remaining beer can slipped from his fingers, clattering forgotten on the stones. "Oh, my balls!" Colin's voice had risen several octaves as he fell to the ground, folding in on himself like a burst balloon. He landed with a wet splash in the puddle of his own making, his drunken confidence replaced by high-pitched whimpers of regret. Peter's leg had already pulled back, returning to position with the same ceremonial accuracy as any parade movement. His posture went back to its perfect stillness, as though he'd never moved at all. Only the slight swing of his bearskin hat showed that any movement had happened. The veteran in the crowd coughed to hide a grim smile. His wife's hand covered her mouth to hide what might have been shock or satisfaction. Other watchers stood in stunned silence, taking in what they'd just seen. The guard's reaction had been so quick, so accurate, that it almost seemed like a trick of the evening light. Colin rolled on the ground, clutching his wounded pride and much more tender parts. His previous confidence had vanished, replaced by the pained groans of a man learning a very expensive lesson about respect. "Why?" he squeaked between gasps. "Bloody hell. Why?" Security cameras continued their silent watch, though their footage would later prove unclear. After all, royal guards were known for their accurate movements, their disciplined routines. If one such movement happened to cross with a drunk man's rude behavior, well, that was hardly the guard's fault, was it? "Jesus Christ," Colin wheezed, still curled in a ball. The evening air carried the sound of approaching footsteps. Palace security finally arrived to handle the situation, their pace unhurried, as though that they'd given the guard plenty of time to handle things his own way first. The veteran nodded approvingly as he watched Colin's continued struggles on the ground. In his years of service, he'd learned that sometimes the most effective lessons came from quick, accurate responses. The guard's action had been perfect, quick enough to seem almost accidental, strong enough to make sure the message wouldn't be forgotten. Peter stood at his post exactly as he had before, exactly as he would continue to do. His boots, though slightly damp, still caught the evening light. The only difference was the groaning figure at his feet, learning the hard way that some lines shouldn't be crossed, some uniforms shouldn't be disrespected, and some lessons had to be taught in a language even the drunkest idiot could understand. 2 police officers came to the scene, their pace slow as they took in the situation before them. Colin stayed curled on the ground, his pained whimpers a stark contrast to his earlier loudness. The wet patch beneath him, partly beer, partly his own doing, spread slowly across the old stones. "Evening, sir." The older officer spoke to Colin with professional calm. "Seems you've had quite a fall." His tone suggested he'd seen similar scenes before, though perhaps not quite as deservedly earned. His younger partner moved to stand on Colin's other side, ready in case their subject decided to try and escape, though given his current state, that seemed unlikely. "He—" Colin gasped, still clutching his injured pride. "He kicked me, right in the—" Another wave of pain cut off his protest, his face twisting as the full impact of his bad choices continued to echo through his body. The older officer shared a knowing look with his colleague. Did he now? He glanced at Peter, who remained perfectly still at his post, the very picture of ceremonial discipline. Funny, I didn't see any breaking of formation. Did you, Jenkins? No, sir, the younger officer replied, hiding a smile. Just standard guard movements as far as I could tell. He took out his notebook, pen ready. Though I do see evidence of public urination, drunk and disorderly conduct, and assault on a member of the Queen's Guard. Colin's protests grew weaker as the officers began listing his offences. The veteran, who had watched the whole scene unfold, stepped forward, his army bearing clear as he spoke to the officers. "If you need a witness statement," he offered. "I saw this young man deliberately urinating on the guard's uniform. The guard kept his position admirably. I'd say he maintained his stance perfectly." "Maintained position through the whole thing, did he?" The older officer's voice had a note of approval. "That's dedication to duty, that is." He turned back to Colin, who had managed to push himself to a sitting position, though his face was still pale and strained. "Right then, sir. Let's get you sorted out." Colin could only nod weakly as they led him towards their waiting vehicle. His swagger was gone, replaced by a wobbly walk that had little to do with alcohol. Each step seemed to remind him of the painful lesson he had learned about respect and consequences. The veteran and his wife stayed a moment longer, watching as the police car pulled away. "Proper form, that was," the veteran said, loud enough for Peter to hear. "Perfect execution. Almost like a parade drill." His wife squeezed his arm, understanding the deeper appreciation in his words. The remaining watchers began to leave, though their quiet conversations had tones of satisfaction rather than shock. Several nodded respectfully as they passed Peter's post, a new understanding in their eyes. This wasn't just a man in a special uniform. This was a soldier who commanded respect, not through words or movement, but through unwavering dedication to duty. In the days that followed, the event at Buckingham Palace became a quiet legend among the guards who stood watch over these important grounds. Not because Peter had broken the rules, officially he hadn't moved at all, but because he'd shown something far more important, the fine line between ceremony and substance. The red jacket and bearskin cap might look ceremonial to tourists, but they represent something deeper. Each guard who wears this uniform carries the weight of centuries of tradition and, more importantly, the responsibility of protecting what that tradition stands for. These aren't costumes worn for show. They're symbols of dedication, earned through tough training and proven in war zones around the world. Peter's response that evening hadn't just been about defending his personal dignity. It was about maintaining the honor of every soldier who'd ever stood watch at these gates. From the trenches of World War I to the deserts of Afghanistan, generations of guards had upheld these traditions through their service and sacrifice. The uniform demanded respect, not because of its appearance, but because of what it represented. Some might question whether such quick justice was necessary, but those who understand army service know that respect isn't just given. It's earned through dedication, maintained through discipline, and sometimes enforced through action. The measured response Peter delivered wasn't born of anger or revenge. It was a calculated reminder that behind the ceremonial look stood a highly trained soldier. The veteran who witnessed the event later said to his wife, "People forget these lads aren't statues. They're warriors who choose to stand still, who accept disrespect daily because their duty demands it. But every man has his line, and when that line is crossed—" He didn't need to finish the thought. The lesson had been delivered with perfect accuracy, just like every other aspect of guard duty. For those who serve, the uniform is more than cloth and buttons. It's a testament to the unwavering dedication needed to stand watch in summer heat and winter cold, to keep perfect composure when faced with countless taunts, to represent something greater than oneself. When Colin chose to disrespect that uniform, he wasn't just insulting a single guard. He was attacking the principles of service, honor, and duty that the uniform represents. Peter continued his duties in the days that followed, his posture as perfect as ever. If his boots shone with extra brightness during inspections, if his movements had an even sharper precision, only his fellow guards noticed. They understood that sometimes the most important lessons about respect are taught not through words or rules, but through quick, accurate actions that leave lasting impressions. In the end, the event served as a powerful reminder. These guards stand watch not just over buildings and grounds, but over traditions that have survived centuries because men like Peter make sure they do. Their stillness isn't weakness, it's strength held back. Their silence isn't submission, it's discipline in action. And when that discipline is tested beyond reason, they remain capable of delivering lessons that won't soon be forgotten. The Royal Guards aren't just men standing still in special uniforms. They're living symbols of dedication, discipline, and duty. Sometimes maintaining those values requires more than just silent dignity. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Should the guard have waited for police intervention? Or was this quick justice exactly what was needed? Tell us what you think about where the line should be drawn between keeping ceremonial composure and defending the honor of the uniform. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more powerful stories about the men who stand guard over not just buildings and grounds, but the very principles of service and respect that our society is built upon.